name is Sheila Lamb, and I'm with the Virginia SBDC Network. For those of you that are not familiar with our organization, the Virginia Small Business Development Center is a partnership program between the U.S. Small Business Administration, George Mason University, and local host institutions throughout Virginia. With 26 locations across the Commonwealth, we provide training and technical assistance to small businesses in their local communities. Our one-on-one advising services are available at no charge. Today's webinar, Optimizing Production in the Craft Beverage Sector, is presented by the Virginia SBDC Network. Stay tuned for our next craft beverage webinar taking place April 23rd at 11 a.m. We are recording today's presentation and it will be posted on our website, virginiasbdc.org. Due to the large number of participants, everyone's microphone is muted and the chat feature is turned off. But if you have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the Q&A box. We have also enabled the live transcript function, which you can show or hide via your own meeting controls. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Virginia SBDC Craft Beverage Assistance Program Manager, Chris Van Orden.
Thank you, Sheila. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation about improving production processes in the craft beverage sector. As Sheila said, my name is Chris Van Orden, and I serve as the manager of the Craft Beverage Assistance Program at the Virginia SBDC at George Mason University. Today, our conversation is going to be a free-flowing discussion about the ways in which alcohol producers can sharpen up production. As always, you can enter any questions that you have in the Q&A function, not the comments, please. And we'll do our best to answer them all either during or after the webinar. So I'm excited to welcome today's speaker, Nassim Sultan, who's not only an experienced production leader, but also the founder of BarrelVision Consulting. Welcome, Nassim.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Great.
Yeah, we got a lot of ground to cover here, so we'll dig right in. Right, we're talking about production processes here, right? All the sort of back of house stuff of making products. So there's a lot that can go wrong. There's a lot of things to track. So I think from especially, production people think this way, a lot of it is data, right? Just information. So broadly speaking, what information needs to be tracked during a production day to make sure that you're being efficient, high quality, hitting all the marks that you need to?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, before we even talk about data, it's important to have both specifications lined up for your products and also key performance indicators. Without those, it's hard to know whether or not you're hitting your marks and whether or not you're actually being efficient. So with that in mind, I mean, certainly when you're starting out, knowing your processes and knowing what those benchmarks are might be difficult, but after a few production sessions, you'll start to see, hey, okay, my lauter takes an hour and a half. And maybe that's the best you can do, maybe not. Later on, you can tweak. But with those specs and KPIs in place, that's where data can really shine, and that's where tracking data on a regular basis really will help you out. So we're talking times, temperatures, pH, gravity. And gravity takes multiple forms. There's specific gravity, there's Brix, there's Plato, and either way tracking your sugar concentration. That's what we're doing. All that goes a long way. You can get really nitty-gritty too. I mean, ambient temperature goes a long way. I would add though that there's other information that's important to track, sensory information in particular. So, what do your raw ingredients look like and smell like when they arrive? Chances are everything's just fine, but in the off chance that something isn't quite right, noting that down can go a long way, so that later on, if something comes up, hey, something wasn't quite right here. Was this the source of the problem? Maybe, maybe not. Um, I'll add that a lot of this too isn't necessarily about efficiency on the day of production. So much of it comes down to uh, avoiding problems down the line, so keeping yourself efficient later. But also then, if something does come up, you're well set up to do a little problem solving, a little sleuthing. Okay, so uh, your product, your beer, let's say, didn't didn't finish at a low enough gravity, at least the one you were hoping for. Why is that? Well, if you've got the data and the information about your raw materials, you can start sifting through and figuring out, okay, well, there's this, there's that, and it gives you a lot of information to start to dig a little deeper.
Yeah, I want to touch on that because I think
Yeah,
that's a really good point about like the importance of measuring all these things, hey, when it's working well or just having a baseline, because a lot of times something goes wrong and it could be any of 10 issues. And some of these things are easily quantifiable, like you said, right? Gravity, right? It's a number, temperatures, right? We have instruments to measure these things, but if it's right, some of these things that are a little bit out of your control, right? Agricultural ingredients, right? There's a range of things, and some of them may be a little more qualitative. Um, Still, having records of that is really important to be able to, right, process improvements, but also issue spotting.
yeah. And I'll add that especially with raw materials, depending on who you're getting them from, they might have their own different specs. So let's say you change suppliers and things don't quite work out the same way. Um, you if you can compare product sheets for each one, you can start to figure, oh, their moisture content is a little bit higher or lower, or friability or something like that. Um, I made a loaf of bread over the weekend using some locally milled grain, and it turned out really well, but it performed very differently from the King Arthur flour I'm used to. And so it's that kind of information. Now, I didn't have product sheets, and nor was I going to compare
Mhm.
product sheets to make a loaf of bread. But even so, it's that kind of, for me, exemplifies what you're getting yourself into, and having that data can help you understand, well, if I was a commercial baker, uh, what do I need to know to help me understand how to use that wonderful flour in the future? And I would say as well, particularly, maybe not particularly, but with local growers and maltsters, having that
Mhm.
information, they may not do things quite the same way as the big growers and maltsters, and for good reason. So definitely having those records on hand. Um, there was one other thing that came to mind, and I'll have to come back to it in a moment.
Yeah, no worries. That's great. Yeah, I think it's there's a lot of information here, the things that people are controlling themselves elsewhere, the production itself and all the stuff that leads up to that. So I think there's a lot to keep track of here. We don't have to dive into all of that, but I think it's good to touch on, right, things just like water composition or you're in the brewing space, strike temperature, right? If you want to just kind of talk through that as an example of the ways in which right, data and sort of this stuff can result in a very different outcome. If breweries are not tracking it, they won't know why.
Yeah, absolutely. That strike temperature is a great leaping off point for that. I mean, certainly, with with brewing, your mash temperature, the mash being the mixture of the grain and the water, is going to significantly impact the fermentability of the subsequent liquid, which with yeast added to it gets fermented. So fermentability is going to impact not only your final alcohol content, but also the amount of residual sugars, which can lead to having more body in the final product. So jumping back to your strike temperature, well, it has a big impact. If you have a higher strike temperature, you're going to get more residual sugars, less alcohol, more body. Lower strike temperature, the inverse. So less body, more alcohol. And so if you're not tracking that and you're seeing variability in your final gravity of that product, you're not necessarily going to know, is it because of the strike temperature? I'll add as well that it's a great way to um, not that I'm advocating for any sort of big brother tactics, but you can keep an eye on your operators that way. Is everybody consistent with how they're brewing? It's amazing how even with well laid out plans for how everybody should brew, there still can be slight variations from operator to operator. And so having that data on hand not only allows you that opportunity again to figure out, well, what's going on here, in this case with the strike temperature, If it's all over the place, it gives you a clear indication that that's probably the reason your final gravity is also all over the place. But also side benefit is, well, how are my employees? How are my operators? How are they, handling the brew day? Maybe they're all doing it a little bit differently. And there's a point, again, that's where the data can serve you well. Also, you can start to say, okay, we need different processes for how we go through our brew day, and we need to streamline those processes. We need to homogenize those processes, and that's where having that data can come in handy.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we can talk about SOPs in a little bit. That's because I think that's right, something that especially companies that might be going from one person back of house to bringing in multiple people. Well, it's not always a great thing if somebody says, "Oh, I could tell who was on the floor when this particular run was, batch was produced." That's not great. You want inter-batch reliability. We had I think, a somewhat cheeky question come in that said basically you should track everything closely correct. Of course, the answer yes is tracking everything, knowing what to track, and having baselines, I think, is something that we're kind of emphasizing. If there's external benchmarks, once you get more um, dialed in on your specific recipes on your system and different suppliers, then it's having your own baseline to operate off of. Right. So that some of this is knowing what to track, knowing how to measure these things. It's not some of these are easier, and right, temperatures are easy to track, but people, like, how often do you take gravity readings?
Yeah.
Right. If you're tracking the fermentation, it's not just a beginning and end. You mean if you're aiming for a 10-day fermentation, are you going to get there in time? Are you overactive?
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Exactly. And that's where tracking this information is so useful. Uh,
mhm,
just like Chris said, is your fermentation, if you're not taking gravities every day, maybe your fermentation isn't going along properly, and you don't know that until it's too late to make an adjustment. Maybe you do need to bump up the temperature of fermentation a little bit or down a little bit because you're fermenting too quickly. And I think especially in smaller facilities where you may not have the ability to count yeast cells, you're kind of going by volume, which is uh, it gets the job done, and you can be consistent going that way, but certainly larger breweries with their larger facilities, from alcoholic beverage facilities, they're counting their cells, and they're able to get pretty exact with that, and that allows for even more consistent fermentations. And so without that, the next best thing is tracking your gravities on a daily basis, maybe even twice a day early on, and then graphing it out. You don't need to do anything fancy. It can just be a rudimentary hand-drawn graph, and that allows you to compare from batch to batch. And here's the other thing too about having this data. Maybe there isn't really a difference from one batch to the other, or from batch one to batch three, but then you notice from batch one to batch five, like, hey, fermentation used to last 5 days. Now it's taking six and a half. What's going on there? There are
mhm.
a lot of things like that where the adjustment could be so small that from batch to batch you don't necessarily notice. And actually, that's one thing I want to emphasize here, and this is the power of data, and tracking this information. Sometimes things seem one way, but then you look at the data, and it turns out something opposite. Or maybe it doesn't seem like there's any problem at all, and then you look at the data and realize, oh, hey, this is actually becoming an issue. My final gravities are slowly creeping up. Um, if you don't have that information on hand, it's hard to determine that. And I'll
Mhm.
add that a lot of this stuff is just a quick note. Like taking a gravity does not take that long. Taking time and temperature, and in this regard, having habits and routines goes a long way. Just a quick piece of history: the hydrometer was an incredibly important creation for the production of alcoholic beverages. Before that, brewers and vintners were just kind of going by feel, and then all of a sudden the hydrometer comes out, and now they can be much more precise. And so that's a long way of saying it's it's been a long time since the hydrometer came out, and use it, because you will get invaluable data, and the time it takes, which isn't long, but the time it takes is well worth it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, taking all of that, right? Some of this is getting the systems in place, and the very first step in all of this is developing a recipe, right?
Yeah.
You're not going in there and winging it. You're developing a recipe, right? Whether you're making beer, wine, spirits, cider, whatever it might be,
Yeah.
you're putting together a recipe with a goal in mind. And so, what considerations should a producer have when they're developing a recipe to make it actually useful on a production floor, right? It's not just as easy as saying, I'm, making a Viognier, I'm making an IPA.
Yeah.
What then? So, what kind of information should they have in there, and what should they be keeping in mind as they're developing a recipe?
Yeah, so dovetailing off what Chris just said, I'll say that certainly the start of the conversation is, well, what kind of product are we talking about? Because the nitty-gritty from that point is going to be fairly different. I mean, if we're talking about a distilled spirit, even there, is it going to be aged, or is it not going to be aged? Because then the recipe is more than just the list of ingredients. So if we're talking about wine, yeah, is it going to be a single varietal? Is it going to be a blend? And with beer, there's a lot of permutations. And I think so again, the more specific conversation is going to depend on what we're talking about. But beyond that, I think the first place is to define your goals. And a little bit of that is your own inspiration. Okay, what's your vision for that product? What flavors do you want in there? And certainly, some people may not want to hear this, but check in with your marketing department. They're going to have ideas if you have a marketing department.
Mhm.
They're going to have ideas, and uh, you're going to want a level of harmony between production and marketing. I know we all want to just kind of experiment and have a great time. And I would encourage everybody to make space for that because that's important too. If you're not experimenting, um, how do you know what your next new product's going to be? But at the same time, having that marketing plan in place and having products that synchronize to that marketing plan goes a very long way.
Yeah.
So again, inspiration. What are your thoughts? What do you want this product to taste like? What are the flavor elements? Maybe there's an ingredient you want to feature. Maybe you want to use locally grown corn. So how do you make that shine? Um, in a dark beer, it might be a little bit more difficult, but there's still possibilities to tell a great story with locally grown corn in a dark beer. But certainly in a light beer, it's going to be more emphasized. And in that case, you probably don't want to be heavily hopped because those hops are then going to mask over the character of that corn. So what are your goals?
I
Beyond
want to
that,
touch on something you said there,
yeah,
Nassim.
yeah,
I really liked your point about the sort of balancing the sort of artistic expression of all this, right? It maybe was at some point in the past, hey, you make something, we make the products that we like to drink.
yeah,
That might have been enough. Now it's a more competitive space. So
yeah,
even at the stage of recipe development, right, certain products, if they're hard to categorize, it can be hard to sell sometimes because you're trying to tell the story. It's hard for your salespeople, your front of house staff to be able to move product that they have to put together a dissertation to explain it, right?
yeah,
Now you want to have you can have those deep thoughts about product as you develop them. It shouldn't be just perfunctory, but marketability of a product is important, and
yeah,
people sometimes lose sight of that because they're so enamored with the process. So I think that developing the recipe, and I know we're going to involve into the conversation about right actually like what goes into a recipe and the information that needs to be contained. But I really like the idea of when developing that target like right, this is not just making product for you to enjoy yourself. That's really nuanced. There's also the business element of this in the recipe development, both in terms of course, like cost efficient recipe building, and we can talk about that later too. But
yeah.
also, right, is this product match your value proposition, your place in the market? Can your team sell this product while also still making something that you're proud to put out there?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a side note, this is you know separate but linked to this conversation. You're probably going to want to have some sort of all hands meetings or at least coordination between the marketing team and the back of house the production team because you want the production team to be happy and on board with the plan. And if they understand that, and if they understand that there's going to be room for experimentation, and getting, their creativity involved, I think it's gonna be easier to then have them on board with that marketing, or excuse me, that production calendar that we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, because you want them happy. You want the whole thing. You don't want any sort of turf war going on. Not that I'm saying I've seen that, but and that's a little bit hyperbolic of me to put it like that. But you want everybody to be happy and synchronized and kind of on board with the plan.
Hmm.
Um, so you know, but picking up from there, I think the other thing that comes to mind with putting together a recipe is simplicity goes a long way. It's certainly with beer, start with something that's kind of basic. You can always flesh it out. I would say as well, when you're choosing ingredients, um, know why you're adding each one. Jumping back to that corn example, and let's make it a dark beer. Well, what else do you want to emphasize? Do you want it to be super roasty or kind of just lightly roasty? Well, different
Hmm.
dark malts are going to give you different characteristics, and even how you use it then the brewing process is going to matter. What kind of base malt do you want and why? Do you want some caramel malt in there? Well, probably because you've got that corn in there that's going to have a little bit of a sweetness, and maybe you want to amp that up a little bit with a lighter crystal malts, because that's going to just add a little bit of sweetness and maybe a honey character, and that's going to vibe pretty well with that corn, even if it is in the background. And so I think one other thing to keep in mind with a lot of the best products out there, the recipes are pretty basic. They're not
Hmm.
overly exotic. There are some breweries that are able to do these really complex recipes. I want to say Cigar City is one of those breweries.
Hmm.
I wouldn't strive for that at first. I would say keep your life simple. There's a lot you can do with just a handful of ingredients. And I'd say also jumping back to products like wine or distilled spirits. Um, the great thing about wine is you've got all these wonderful flavor character components within the grapes themselves, and depending on how you ferment them, you can have wildly different products, and there's options for blending as well. With distilled spirits, I mean, depending on your type of equipment, do you have a pot still? What type of pot still? Do you have a column still? Well, what type of column still?
Hmm.
What kind of wood are you aging in? There's all these questions that relate to the product. So, and the recipe itself, though, can be pretty, just the raw materials, the raw ingredients, I should say, that lead to the liquid. You don't necessarily need a whole lot there to end up with a wonderfully complex product. And I think that would actually be one warning I would give is that there's kind of the spectrum where you have a product that maybe ends up being a little bit too basic. Maybe you want more complexity. But I would warn against that. You want to have something that, again, depending on what your marketing goals are, maybe you don't want that actually. But depending on
Hmm.
your marketing goals, maybe you don't want that. Maybe you just want something kind of in the middle of the road with a nice amount of complexity. And the aspect I would warn against is too much complexity.
Hmm.
One of my colleagues described it as kind of when there's too much complexity, the beer kind of tastes brown, and I think that's a great way to describe it. All of a sudden, you know there are these flavors there. You can't quite picking them apart because there's almost too much complexity, and maybe there's some super tasters out there who could pick them apart, but how many of your guests or clients or buyers are super tasters? At the end
Yeah.
of the day, I think there's a lot of value in having a product that has a nice amount of complexity because it's going to
Hmm.
be approachable. And approachable doesn't have to be basic. Again,
Yeah.
your marketing, talk to your marketing department. There's a lot of value in pretty basic beers too. There's some light ales and light lagers that are great to drink on a hot day because they're kind of basic. That doesn't mean they have to be boring either.
Yeah.
So that's one other element of recipe formulation. There's a difference between basic and boring. I'll say that one more time.
I like the sort of clarity of vision argument here, right? The kitchen sink, uh, is not always the most appealing product that's out there.
Yeah.
I think, it's important for everybody who's on the production floor, just by the fact that you're tuning into this webinar, you're more interested in and expert in the sort of production and the product itself than 99% of your audience. So it's not to say it needs to be dumbed down, but it needs to be approachable for the average person. And I think that, when it comes to ingredient selection, right, for sure, right, not getting kind of a muddy end product, and same goes for, right, overcomplicated or overwrought recipes of any sort. But I think there's also efficiencies, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about balancing, right, not having to have 10 hops in a beer.
Right.
I think there's, sort of winemakers and distillers giving themselves some leeway for down the road blending, and, some of these things where if you're having a, a red blend as a winemaker, or if you're a whiskey producer and you have different barrels that you're going to blend together, you have the ability to kind of blend streams together to reach the end result. But having too much complexity on the front end could also be a hindrance here. So I think um, there's lots to balance, but I think that you're all coming back to, when you're thinking about ingredients, and this probably goes for like production processes as well. Not that you have to justify it, but being able to explain, well, why add that? Why is that needed? How does that help? And if you're adding Vienna and Munich malts in various, right, like, well, did they all need to do that?
Right. And real quick, just one other point related directly to that. And this is exactly why we're talking about not avoiding too much complexity. Early on in my brewing career, looking through all these really delicious sounding malts, and you kind of want to put them all in there, and your reason might be because they sound really tasty. But that's where I caution you against that, and that's where I say, like, that's why we're talking about the complexity factor, because if you put all of them in there, um, you might be overloading it and ending up with a brown tasting beer. And so I think having that restraint and knowing that you can always add in 1 or 2 or 3% later on, starting out basic, um, can go a very long way. And I'll say actually one other quick point about that. Starting also restraint in terms of percentages. You don't necessarily want to overload a beer with a particular flavor. If we're talking about specialty malts, or maybe um, something, I'm trying to think of something else related to
Mm-hmm.
distilled spirits and wine. I'll leave that alone for now. But just in terms of beer, it with a specialty grain, maybe you only want 1 to 5%, just to give it an accent.
Mm-hmm.
And you can always tweak. You can always add 1 to 3% more, and certainly pay attention. I will say this as well, kind of related to a little bit to the data and a little bit to this part of the conversation. Do your research, because some ingredients you really only want to use maybe 1 to 10%, and anything
Mm-hmm.
more than that, and you're going to get into dangerous territory. And if you don't do that homework, you might not realize that and end up with a product that's not overly palatable.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Your black patent malts or a stuck mash of a
Yeah,
raw grain. Yeah. All those horror stories. And I'll just, we don't have to touch on it here because there's so much variety,
yeah,
but right, this is just like the sort of flavors and some of the ingredients. Obviously, developing a recipe, being extremely precise in targets. So some of this is understanding, having been through many production days previously, but saying, here's the strike temp, right? Like we mentioned, is saying, are you looking for more fermentable sugars or more bodies,
yeah,
right? Are we talking about, like, knowing your system and being able to say, based on the grain bill that I've put together, I'm expecting this much fermentable sugar. I'm expecting, right, this much, like this initial gravity. There's tolerances with any number that you're putting together, but you should have a good handle on, this recipe should yield these things.
yeah,
If I'm using this yeast, it has this, degree of fermentability that's gonna means that I can get this down here, right? Some of these things are doing the homework, but
yeah,
having really specific targets with relatively tight sort of parameters, so that your production team knows if something's out of spec, right?
yeah.
That's like, if you don't have the specs down on paper, you can go a long time before you realize, oh no, like, why are we, I was expecting this to be a 7% beer, but it's only going to reach 5.5. That's a different product.
Yeah. And I'll add related two things related to that. The first being that's also where having a written recipe goes a long way. So people aren't wondering, hey, what are we shooting for again? Is there actually supposed to be a hop edition of 15 minutes or not? And if so, how big? And what's our ballpark, for maybe not even ballpark, what's our goal for bitterness units? And I'll say as well, one thing with jumping way back, but linking to what Chris just said, in
Mhm.
terms of having specs for your products, they don't have to be, they should be specific, their specifications, but you can have a tolerance range. I think Chris's word there, tolerance is spot on. And you've got to determine, well, just how much tolerance do you want to have?
Mhm.
Is it a half degree Plato each way? Is it 5 IBUs each way, or maybe it's less? Maybe you want a total tolerance of 5. So, give or take 2.5 each way. And that's for you to determine. Certainly, as at first, you might want to cut yourself a little bit of slack, but in the long run, you're going to want to be creating these consistent products.
Mhm.
And that's where having tighter tolerances are going to be in your favor because you're going to be then serving your guests and customers products that are pretty much the same time and time again because that's what they
Yeah.
expect.
And that's, definitely a little easier for the grain-based beverage producers, right?
Yes.
You're getting a spec sheet and same, if you have hops, all these things, even if it's not consistent year over year, you're getting these things, right? You kind of can adjust recipes to account for that for your fruit-based producers, your wine makers, your ciders, and your fruit distillates. Right. You get what the harvest gives you.
Yeah.
Being able to adjust the recipe, obviously year over year, reliability may not be the same for winemakers, right? You're having vintages. If you're doing a blend that you want people to have a recognizable character, developing recipes based on what nature gives you so that you can arrive at this roughly the same flavor profile and ideally the same price point. Um, but right, there's a slightly different constraints there.
Yeah.
Because if you have, an estate Sauvignon Blanc, well, we all know how much variation there is each year in sort of the terroir element of it all. So slightly different goals there, but that comes down to knowing sort of how to get the best out of the product. And there's still just the same amount of attention to developing a recipe. So we've talked about recipe development here.
Yeah.
We did touch on some of the um, sort of spec side of things, and a lot of that, right? Whether no matter what your kind of specific subsector you're in, comes with the inputs. And uh, right, if you're a producer, you need to have a good relationship with your suppliers and make sure that you're getting what you need from them, both information and quality, product wise. So, how can companies get a get the most out of the relationship with their suppliers?
I think, yeah, that's a great question. I think it starts a lot with your knowing your own needs. And what does that mean? Okay, it means knowing which products you're going to make throughout the course of a year, and when you're going to make them. And coming with that also is, of course, what flavors you're looking for.
Mhm.
Um, and I mentioned that because that's where the specs for the raw materials come into play. If your supplier runs out of a particular grain and it's kind of crucial to your products, you need to have something lined up that will fit the bill and will be a suitable substitute, hopefully. So certainly knowing what you need, knowing how much you're going to need as well. If it, is it year-round product? Is it a seasonal product? If it's seasonal, all the more reason to have your ducks in a row well in advance because you don't want to end up on your product, a week or two before your production day, and hear from your supplier that, hey, they don't have what you need. And so there's also an element of depending on what kind of product you're making,
Mhm.
can you store your raw materials for a month or more? Maybe, maybe not. Um, but I think with that as well is also communicating and being in regular touch with your supplier, letting them know, hey, here's our calendar, and here's when we're going to make things, and getting to know in that respect also, you're probably going to have a sales rep that you work with on a regular basis. Typically with the large supply houses, they have area managers, and that's the person you're going to be talking to on a regular basis. So if you're communicating with that person regularly and saying well in advance, hey, here's what we have coming up. Is there anything we should be aware of?
Mhm.
They're going to give you feedback. I'll add as well that you never know when maybe you need to buy enough of a particular raw material that, based on that amount, you qualify for a cheaper rate
Mhm.
if you can take delivery of a larger quantity. So, for example, with beer, grains come in 50 or 55-pound bags, but if you're willing to accept a larger amount, you could get something called a super sack. And maybe that works well for you because it's a lot of times for base malt. You need a lot of it. So, okay, get a super sack and save some more per pound. Or maybe you're far enough along in your growth that you can afford to have a silo. And guess what? You're going to get some pretty awesome savings if you're getting a bulk delivery into your silo.
Mhm.
And we're talking like half price. Um, so, and I'm not recommending that to anybody out of the gate because you gotta finance that a silo, and you're not necessarily going to know the intricacies of your annual production, and it might be a mistake, frankly, to have a silo at first. Down the
Mhm.
road, though, there's definitely some savings potentials by buying in bulk. So by having that plan and communicating with your supplier, you can find out, hey, you qualify for these savings. Or, you know, in August, we tend to run out of fill in the blank because
Mhm.
it's annual and it's hard to come by. And if you're communicating, you can hear that and order in advance if possible. I will say as well, tied to this indirectly is also having a production calendar. And that goes a long way in terms of visually informing everyone, here's when we're producing things so that a deadline doesn't sneak up on you.
Mhm.
Every so often, you got to give your supplier a call and say, we ran out of a product or an ingredient we desperately need, and they can get something to you very quickly. You want to avoid that situation, and having a calendar allows you to think well in advance. Okay, we're getting towards the end of March now. Let's say we need to make something at the end of April. Let's start thinking about that now. And
Mhm.
having that calendar is a reminder of like, okay, that deadline's coming up. We need to start preparing. Sometimes you need 90 days to figure something out,
Mhm.
and all the more reason to be in regular communication with your supplier. I'll add as well, just again, not directly related to this question, but a side product of having this information is that you can then also communicate it to your wholesaler, and they're going
Mhm.
to appreciate this too. I recognize we're talking about suppliers here and how to work well with them, but I will say that with wholesalers, having this exact same information, when you're going to produce stuff, how much you're going to produce, what your production calendar is, they're going to love that because they're going to know what to expect and when.
Mhm. Yes, that's a great way to endear yourselves both up and downstream with your partners, right? This is going to make your life much easier. Sometimes it can be hard, especially when you're in the throes of business to, okay, all those meetings together, plan out the year, right? There's always some guesswork and some volume, right? You're going to run out of something, or right, you're never going to nail it where the end of Q1, the last bottle of whatever sells, right? But
Yeah.
it's going to make life easier for sure with their sort of downstream partners. They're going to appreciate the clarity that they get from you. It's easier to set goals for them when you say, well, I told you you were going to have this much product.
Yeah.
Let's find a way to move it. Um, but I think, and the upstream side too, right? Being smarter about ordering, developing smart recipes so that
Yeah.
don't have three products that do the same thing, because you mentioned minimum order quantities, MOQ, or quantity discounts, sorry,
Yeah.
QDs, where it's a lot cheaper to buy 2 tons of one ingredient
Yeah.
than 1 ton of two ingredients, right?
Right.
There's a lot of value to that. The same goes for things like hops, having things under contract.
Yeah.
You're buying them in advance. If you're buying things on the spot market, maybe every once in a while you catch a break because somebody's liquidating something, but it's going to be a lot more expensive to order stuff as needed just on the fly. And that could be really hard. And that goes for sort of packaging materials too. Maybe not something that people are excited to think about. But I've had some of that experience of, right, just being uh, in charge of, do we have the labels that we need? How much,
Right.
how many batches do we have on hand? Can you get quantity discounts on those labels? Well, can you spread those across designs? And they say, well, yes, if you fill a palette of various designs, you get a better rate. Great. That you just saved a little bit of money, which is more money in your pocket or allows for a little more breathing room.
Yeah.
You're just a little bit sharper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only that was all fantastic, and I can't add anything to it. I could emphasize. I want to emphasize that everything Chris just said is spot on and very much related. And in particular with items that aren't going to spoil. Uh,
Mhm.
you know, the main factor at that point is going to be how much storage space do you have. And if you can store a lot of cans, you might be able to get a better rate of
Mhm.
cans. But be careful because um, if you don't have that space, they may end up charging you warehousing fees, which could be, not so great and offset other savings you've had. So be mindful of that too. And again, that's where having a plan comes into play, knowing what you need when you need it. And also, I will emphasize what Chris said. The spot market's great for picking up things now and then. Um, but having a contract in place is a great way to save money. Certainly, there are times where the spot market might feel like a much better deal. It's also very volatile. Like any spot market, it's going to go up and down. And one moment there might have been a deal, but the next moment, your contract is the deal.
Mhm.
So certainly avail yourself of the spot market, but those contracts are more secure.
It could be very hard to know the cost of goods, and we didn't talk about that in recipe development per
Yeah.
se, but right, a lot of the cost of goods are associated with your inputs. It's very hard to know how much money you make on an individual product here. Um, that is going to be very hard to do if your ingredient costs are shifting all the time.
Yeah.
Um, not an easy one. We had a question come in here. So somebody asked about what your experience was. They are a producer of a non-alcoholic drink, and they just wanted to know sort of what your background is.
Yeah, I mean, my background is in brewing. I will add, I've worked in breweries for 7 years and had experience beyond that, outside of the production area. I will add that I have a couple of certifications from the Institute of Brewing and Distilling. I have a general certificate in brewing from them. I also have a diploma in distilling from the Institute of Brewing and Distilling. There's actually a lot of overlap between brewing and distilling. If you're making whiskey, you're effectively making unhopped beer and then distilling it. So I won't go too much further into that, but that is kind of, I'm happy to talk offline some more about my experience, but that's the long and short of it.
Yeah. And I'll
Uh,
say, Nassim has been a sort of one-man shop for a brewery before. So he was the chief decision maker of right recipe development, executing all of these things, top to bottom. So I think that that's part of why I wanted to bring him in here today is that he's seen the full process. He didn't just have one lane. He's
yeah.
got a nice holistic vision of the sort of back of house processes.
And I'll just talk about briefly about that. That's a great point. Thank you, Chris. In each of my roles, they were holistic. It was doing a little bit of everything and needing to understand how to do those things well. So it wasn't jack of all trades, master of none. It was really mastering each one. So in each role, it was okay, really understanding cellar work well to care for the product, clean tanks properly. It was mastering the brew house to produce the best possible beers with great yields too. And then eventually it was being a head brewer, which means everything's on my shoulders. So ordering products, excuse me, raw materials, making them, cleaning the tanks, keeping the brewery clean, training staff up front so they understand what a product is about so they can then sell it better. It's informing managers. It's training people on the brewing process in general. It's kind of, as a head brewer in a small brewery, you're doing everything. It's
Hmm.
quality control. It's um, I could go on and on, but and they were all fantastic experiences because that I have this wonderful breadth of knowledge that again isn't jack of all trades, master of none. It's really needing to understand everything in detail. I'll add as well that um, I think a lot of people think of brewing as just the act of creating a beer, like the production day. But the reality is, it's so much more than that because if your tank isn't clean, you're going to end
Hmm.
up with a tainted beer. So you need to understand how to make that tank clean, so when you do make the beer, it doesn't have messed up. Oh, and with your draft lines, if they're not clean, then when the customer drinks it, it's not going to taste right. So you need to understand how to have clean draft lines and
Hmm.
how often you need to clean, what chemicals. So it really is a little bit of everything. And even understanding, the glycol chiller in back, how's that operating so I can understand if it's not operating properly, do I need to call somebody in?
Yeah, there's lots and lots to know. And hopefully the folks that are in here today are, um, yeah, this is there's a lot, a lot that people need to know and all this stuff. And I think some folks, right, this actually does lead to the next question. Right, there's a lot of people that when they start their businesses, if they're, no matter what, the sector is, there might be a very small production team, right? And you're not coming in with, oh, like you have your packaging tech and you have your seller person and you have, right. It might just be one person wearing that hat of,
Yeah.
I am back of house, I am the production team. So sometimes when you're in a small team like that, 1 to 2 people, they might be able to do things by feel. They keep things in their head, right? And this is a problem for a lot of small businesses when they're growing, no matter what department you're in. Whereas a lot of just the institutional knowledge in 1 to 2 people, but as teams grow, right? We all want to see companies growing. Ideally, they're employing more people, and that production kind of is now touched by multiple people. So production needs to be standardized. We touched this a little bit about, right, interbatch reliability. So I think this is a good time to talk about standard operating procedures, SOPs, and writing those things down. Yes, thank you, Maria. Uh, Get Vita, very cool. We will check it out. Um, right, writing SOPs, putting these things out on paper. What does the process of developing SOPs look like?
Yeah. I'll start just by once again emphasizing something Chris said because I think it's important that SOPs are a tool for not only standardizing but helping onboard people, making sure everybody's doing the same thing, and knowing that so that at some point you can just walk away and know that they're going to do things the right way, and the way that you want them done in your organization. So I think the starting point for writing SOPs is knowing the process inside and out, and you don't necessarily have to understand the whys. Um, you do need to understand the order of operations. Um, if you don't understand that clearly, that's okay. You can bring in somebody to help you, either help you understand or to help you write the SOPs. But if you don't understand them, you're not going to be able to communicate that clearly to other people. And that lack of clarity is going to lead to confusion and maybe variability then
Mhm.
from person to person. So you need to understand the processes inside and out so that you can then write them down in wonderful detail. You just want to use a lot of detail. You may also want to have a short version, a long version, kind of a cheat sheet, and then the in-depth version, because at a certain point, employees may not want to wade through a wall of text to find the answer to just a quick, like, okay, what's my order of operations generally?
Mhm.
So having a cheat sheet as well is going to go a long way. So a lot of detail. The keys are, okay, a lot of detail, photos, annotated photos,
Mm.
describing. Uh, I remember writing an SOP for a keg cleaner, and the keg cleaner was pretty simple. You push a button, and that was more or less it. But describing like this valve and that valve and where to find them when you've got a wall of valves in front of you, it was quite difficult. So that's where having an annotated photo showing what each valve was for, went a long way so that it didn't have to have a wall of text. Um, Videos, obviously, videos don't necessarily work in an offline document or
Mhm.
in a printed out document, but having videos sometimes is the easiest way to show how a process is done. But they are should not be a replacement for something written down. You still need the written version and use the video to supplement. Um, I will add that you'll also want to have these SOPs, again, available digitally, but available printed out in a central location so anybody can just go and flip through it. They don't necessarily have to be on a computer or a phone.
Mhm.
Um, and you know, I think that was it. I think it comes down to detail, photos, knowing the process inside and out, so you can really write it down the right way. Getting somebody in to help you out if need be. Videos, and yeah, and a printed out version and a digital version. Digital
Yeah.
version going to go a long way.
And one thing that I'll add here, and this is from a little bit of my experience that I never considered, but as soon as I was kind of shown it, it made a ton of sense to me, is for those of us who live on sort of the sort of computers most of the time, you might be familiar with the concept of version control,
Yeah,
right? This is basically saying, okay, when you have final copy .v3.2, that's a little hard, right? So if you're making changes to your production, and that does happen as you dial things in, and maybe you have a higher quality mill, so you're able to do something right, whatever the case may be. Maybe you put in a jacketed fermenter, so you're getting more temperature control. Any kind of things can change on the production floor. Commemorating that in
yeah,
your SOPs, and then making it very clear when the update happened. This is now the authoritative version, because right, if you have, like you said, on the floor SOPs that are out of date,
yeah.
things can go wrong, and they'll say, well, I followed the book. And they said, well, you didn't check the online version. And well, then all of a
Right.
sudden people are mad. There should be somebody who owns the SOPs. Your team can be empowered to make recommended changes,
Yeah.
but having that sort of chain of command when it comes to owning production processes, whoever's in charge there, the ultimate arbiter of production, needs to be able to say, this is the way that we do it. This is authoritative. We have now changed from this to this, and it's been communicated. We're all aware of the change.
And
It can be hard to do because maybe you're busy running around and it's been a long day, and you just helped out on the last packaging run.
yeah.
You don't want to have to go back to your computer and send around the email notifying people of the update, but it's important.
And it is, it absolutely is. And there's a little bit of a tension there because these should be living documents. Once you write an SOP, it's not done. It's just done for now. But at the same time, if you're sending out updates weekly, it becomes that much harder for people to keep up to date of like, wait, what am I supposed to do now?
Hmm.
And so you may want to develop a schedule for doing those updates. Maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's twice a year, and where you're taking in feedback from operators, trying to figure out, okay, is there a better way to do this process? Okay, and so communication is certainly an important aspect of this because you don't want to overload people. You don't want to end up in a situation where somebody feels like they didn't have the proper information available to them. But you also want to make sure that you've got the best possible processes for your facility.
Yeah, it's really really important. I like the idea of revisiting this if it's a auditing, right, walking through it all and making sure that it's everything is done the way it's supposed to. We only have a few minutes left, so
Okay.
I'm going to just go to um, maybe my final question here, which
Sure.
is, right, there's a lot to cover here. We barely scratched the surface, but
Yeah.
this is a very big topic. For maybe for the folks that are listening, whether they're a company in planning or a small brewery, winery, distillery looking to grow, or even
Yeah.
a large company that's already up and running, kind of at full steam. There's lots to know here. Is there something that you wish that every producer knew about the sort of production process, or is there something that I guess if you want to reframe it, is there something that
Yeah.
you knew about production before you started yourself?
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind is keeping emotions out of it. There's this desire to make every batch the best possible, and that is something we should all strive for. But at the same time, not being so emotionally wrapped up in that we aren't able to say that we aren't beating ourselves up if something goes
Hmm.
wrong, because it's just, a luxury product effectively, or maybe not luxury product, but it is not an essential
Hmm.
product for everyone. It is something we choose to consume. And so, and there might be instances where things don't turn out well, and you do need to dump that product. And because that's what makes the most sense in terms of consistency and offering the best possible products. If you're emotionally involved in that product, you might be saying, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't dump it. I really wanted this product badly, but taking that financial hit is often, maybe not always, but often the better route. So I think so often for me, there were times where I'm passionate about these products, so and that comes through. But there are times where in retrospect, um, cutting myself off emotionally would have been easier, and would have led to maybe better, my own internal well-being would have been a little bit better off. And I think whether you're running a brewery or owning a brewery,
Hmm.
or owning a brewery and running the operations of that brewery, there's so many things you need to keep track of, and um, having to manage those things is difficult enough, on top of then having to manage your own emotions if you're annoyed or upset or whatever, about something that didn't go quite right. I think as well, uh, this is a little bit of a different conversation, but certainly related in my own experience as well. Once you take emotions out of it, you can start to see things maybe a little bit more clearly. Maybe there's a good reason that one of your operators was doing things a certain way, but at first you feel kind of annoyed. Why are they doing it that way? Oh, come on, give me a
Hmm.
break. But then you take the emotion out of it and you start to ask, well, maybe there's a reason they're doing this. Let me talk to that person. Because if you're coming at that person with emotion, especially if it's a negative emotion, uh, maybe they're not going to react very well. But if you come at them kind of neutral and kind and open, uh, they're going to be more open and receptive to what you have to say. And maybe it's had nothing to do with something they're doing wrong. Maybe it had to do with some other system that needs to be updated. And so you're upset at what they're doing, but the reality is it's not their fault. It's something else. So I think keeping your emotions in check, keeping emotions out of it. Especially jumping back to that thought of having to dump a product. If you're doing that on a regular basis, you've got other problems, frankly.
Hmm.
But a single batch, yeah, that sucks. But in terms of your costs for an entire year, it's going to be a drop in the bucket. I'm not encouraging people to dump batches all the time. What I'm saying is don't become so emotionally involved that you can't see that you need to dump that batch. Because sometimes, you know what, that product is not, you can't sell it. You can't sell it. Just dump
Hmm.
it and move on, start from scratch. You're going to be better off.
Yeah, it is. This definitely, this industry is a labor of love, and I think it's important for people to, right, be clear-headed about these things. And right, I think that all of the things that we talked about preceding this, putting in the work in advance, you're gonna have fewer cases where you're pulling your hair out of over something, right? You just feel like, hey, you've done the work. These are complicated things here, right? There's a lot of science behind it all, and sometimes things don't work, but
Yeah.
um, it is okay. I think that if you've done all of this work on the front end, you're going to have a lot fewer instances of you know, emotional stress over these things. So,
Yeah.
um, Nassim, really appreciate your time and expertise sharing it with the audience here, and thank you all for tuning in to this month's webinar.
I agree. Nassim, thank you. Thank you,
My pleasure.
Chris.
Thank you.
Thank everyone who also joined us today. We just want to remind you that you will receive an email with a link to this recording so you can go back and watch it again. If you would like to sign up for upcoming webinars or access recorded webinars, please visit virginiasbdc.org/training. These resources are designed to be used in collaboration with your local SBDC advisors. You can sign up for a free and confidential session by emailing help@virginiasbdc.org or via our website. And we do hope to see you at our next session. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks.